Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today we'll be asking a very important question. Should the Church and the West learn the lessons from Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who defied the Nazis? And welcome to the programme, and today's special guest is all the way from Hampshire. His name is Reverend Chris Wickland from the Living Word Church in Ferrum. Great to see you again, Chris.
Good to be here, Simon, as always.
Definitely, and I'm very pleased you're here, particularly as we're talking about the incredible life of Bonhoeffer. But before we unpack his life and the lessons that we can learn from his incredible life in defying the Nazis, we're almost living in a very similar time that he's living in. So you recently were invited, as I was, to attend the screening of the horrors that took place on October the 7th. This is using the body footage from that Hamas took of the atrocity itself and the massacre, as well as CCTV footage that the embassy held. I think this one is actually called Bearing Witness to October the 7th, the Massacre. So share with us your thoughts on what you saw at the embassy.
I think the first thing that was important about this particular video is that the narrative has moved on so quickly. It's no longer about what happened on October the 7th. It's now it's about Israel attacking the Palestinians and what's going on in Gaza. And the narrative has moved on so far now that people are forgetting why this is even happening in the first place. And so watching this footage, they put it together very, very well. So you had body cam footage of the Hamas soldiers, that they wore here, but then you had loads of CCTV footage, and they kind of pieced it all together. So it was almost like a docu-movie, the way that it all fell together. So you saw multiple camera angles of what happened. And I think we witnessed the death of 149 people in 45 minutes. And I remember Douglas Murray saying that what Hamas has done is worse than what the Nazis did. Because the Nazis, when they did atrocious things to the Jewish people, they still had such a problem with conscience that they needed to get drunk most nights to be able to get through the day for the atrocities that they committed, earlier on. But what I saw on this footage, as you've seen as well, is just a complete glorification of the murder of innocent people. These weren't soldiers, these were innocent women, children, and people that had nothing to do with the army or anything like that. And just seeing how they enjoyed it, they phoned up their parents, "Hey Mum, I've killed 10 Jews with my bare hands, aren't you proud of me?" And just shouting and screaming and rejoicing. And some of the way that they were killing people was barbaric, it was evil, it was disgusting. And war is never a pretty thing to be a part of, but this wasn't war. This was the things that they were doing to people was inhumane. It's unrepeatable, the things that they were doing. It showed me a degree of evil to a level that I have never seen before. And so when you see that footage and you see the mentality and the mindset of Hamas and how much they absolutely hate Israel, I think if most of the people that are going out and not rioting, but protesting about, free Palestine, if most of those people, which I know haven't, if most of those people had watched that video that I saw, I think they would have a very different opinion on why Israel went to war and why they are doing what they're doing, protecting their civilians so that they don't have a repeat of what happened on October the 7th. I mean, for me personally, I found it very disturbing. And it's disturbing enough to see what Hamas did to adults, but then when you see, how children were involved in that, and just despicable. I don't want to repeat some of the things that I saw, but it was absolutely shocking. And I think for me, it really put things in perspective for where the church is at today, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But it really made me realise that actually the church needs to speak up about this. The church needs to get on point and say something about this. And the fact that the church won't because politically it's incorrect or theologically it's incorrect, I think is despicable.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that struck me, I think, from seeing that horror video, and it is horrific, especially when you also been to the places where the massacre took place by Hamas on October the 7th, where they murdered 1,200 Israelis and also other foreign residents there, injured between 6,000 and 7,000, took 250 hostage back into that hellhole that is Gaza. And, you know, the scale of October the 7th was never portrayed by our mainstream media. But what struck me the most is seeing these Hamas terrorists chanting all the time, Al Akbar. And our Western media loves to take out the Islamic element to Islamic terrorist attacks. And here, there was no mistaking it. Yeah. And of course, this is then reflected on the big protests that we're seeing right across the UK, right across Europe and across the United States and across the Western world against Israel. It is an Islamist agenda that is mobilizing behind and its support of Hamas. So how much do we need to kind of realize the evil that we're dealing with? Because we haven't seen anything so horrific as this since the Second World War, and that's with the Nazis.
Yeah, just as we were talking just before the show, I don't know, I think I suddenly got hit with an overwhelming fear that actually we really are back in the same scenario that they had in the 1930s in Nazi Germany. And people might go, oh, this is nothing like that. Well, two things. Firstly, you weren't in that situation, so how can you say it's nothing like that? And there's this whole normality bias in our culture and in the media that somehow this isn't as bad as it seems, and you know, and we objectify Israel as being the enemy and being the bad guys without seeing the truth and the evil that's really going on here. And for me, as a pastor and as a British citizen, I'm deeply concerned, you know, politically, what's going on with our election right now and the things that are going on in our country, that we are literally sleepwalking ourselves into another potential 1930 scenario. A lot of Christians, a lot of people go, oh no, you know, that's just extreme. This isn't extreme. When you see the footage that you and I have seen, you know that when you've got an aggressive, secular, leftist agenda that's in partnership with a militant Islamic agenda that's taken over our media and our politics, when you begin to realize that this really is a battle between Judeo-Christian values, which is the Western world values, which is what Israel stands for as well, with the Middle Eastern values and this whole new liberal thing that's coming. And so it really is a battle between good and evil. And I just don't think Christians have got that. They haven't quite got their head around that. And I think if they knew that that's what this is about, I think there are a lot more people would be protesting against these things and speaking out against, and speaking up in churches that actually we need to stop this tide of evil that's come into our theology, that's come into our politics, that's coming into everything. And people don't realize that probably within weeks or months that we could have a whole new agenda on our doorstep through having the wrong government being voted in.
No, absolutely. So as of this recording, we're recording on the eve of the general election. And obviously you watching this program on Friday night will have a better idea of how the election turns out. But let's go with the opinion polls. Let's go with the majority of political analysts who believe that Labour are going to win a huge landslide. And let's say that this turns out to be the reality. We also know that the Labour Party have also catered to the Islamic cause for votes. And I suppose this is going to be the first election where we really do see the Muslim community flexing its political muscles and the influence it will have over the Labour Party and over its foreign policy towards Israel and its in government could create a very dangerous scenario, not only for Israel, but also for us here in Britain and the West. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I really think so. I think Keir Starmer, forgive me for saying this, I think is a bit of a sly fox. Is that since I've seen him come on the political stage, he's always playing the game of how can I get the most votes. So if it means if I go with the liberal guys and, how can I get votes from them? And then the whole thing about, hey, we'll put forward a two-state solution and a Gaza ceasefire and stuff so that he can get the votes from the Muslim voters. It just seems to me that he'll do anything he can to get into a state of power. And I'm reminded of, you probably remember yourself, that when Jeremy Corbyn was leading the Labour Party, how they had their Labour conference, and they're all waving Palestinian flags. Do you remember that? And so there was big uproar about that, and we were very fortunate that Jeremy Corbyn that government didn't get into power. But ironically, I think we've got something now even worse than that, because now we've got someone who's kowtailing to our internal Islamic agenda in this nation, which will then have a geopolitical consequences wider afield that will affect us in ways beyond probably what Jeremy Corbyn had in mind. So I think we're really in quite a dangerous situation right now.
And we're not the only ones that think that. Have a look at this excellent CBN News reports entitled "Dangerous Alliance Coming Against Israel and the Jews."
A moment of existential crisis. That's how our next guest describes the threat to Israel, the United States, and the world at this pivotal time in history. Robert Stearns is overseeing Bishop of the Tabernacle Church of Buffalo. He heads Eagle's Wings. That's a ministry that builds bridges between Christians and Jews. And he's author of the new book, Rise and Rebuild, a guide to overcoming adversity. Bishop Stearns, it's good to have you here in Virginia Beach with us. What don't Christians, even Christians, people in the church, what don't they understand about Israel?
What we don't understand about Israel is that there are twin forces, two forces that pose an existential threat to our way of life, the Judeo-Christian worldview, the basic liberties and freedoms that the West cherishes. And those twin threats are radicalized Islam and far-left militant secularism. And bizarrely, these two forces, militant secularism and radical Islam, are now colluding together against the Jewish state of Israel and against the Jewish people worldwide. Every time we look at history, we see that what starts with the Jews does not end with the Jews. They call Israel the little Satan. They call America and the West the big Satan.
That's not just Iran that says that.
Absolutely not. Iran sends its message of hate and vitriol and jihad and genocide all throughout the world. And we see alliances with Qatar, we see Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, all of this evil encroaching upon this tiny Jewish state.
And we've seen this rising anti-Semitism on our college campuses, and even the White House is lukewarm in the relationship with Israel. Maybe at times even hostile. So what's happening? How has that happened?
Well, it's happened because the church has bought into something called replacement theology that essentially says that God's covenant with Israel is over, God's done with the Jews, and the church is the new Israel, the church is the new Jews. Well, that's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible tells us clearly in the book of Romans that Christians have been grafted into God's covenant with the Jewish people, and that God's covenant with Abraham endures. God says, as long as the sun and moon are in place, this is how strong my covenant is. Last time I checked, the sun and the moon are still lighting up our world. And so when we begin to assault the character of God, which is what replacement theology is. Replacement theology is an assault on the character of God. It's saying, God, you don't keep your promises. You don't keep your covenants. When you do that, you chip away at the foundation of our faith. And the foundation of America and the West is our Judeo-Christian worldview.
So it's really a spiritual battle right now that we're in.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Without question.
And Eagle's Wings, you just returned from a trip to Israel where you had 32 pastors join you.
That's right.
What did they learn? What did they come to understand that they didn't know before they went there?
Well, Eagle's Wings has made it our mission to identify young, emerging pastors and bring them to Israel. Because for so many pastors, the trip to Israel is a bucket list item that they want to do sometime in their life, and they end up doing it in their late 60s, their early 70s, and you've lost 40 years of their ministerial career, 40 years of sermons and of influence over that congregation. So we scholarship young pastors, we bring them to Israel, and what we have found overwhelmingly is that they come back and they say, this is nothing at all like what the media portrays.
Oh, so it's all about moral clarity and making that connection of our faith. Right?
You know, in the late 30s, as Hitler rose to power in Germany, before Nazism took a hold, there was a courageous pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Mm-hmm. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer went to the 18,000 churches in Germany. There were 18,000 churches as Hitler rose to power. And he appealed to those churches to stand against this rising tide of evil. Tragically, only 3,000 churches stood with Bonhoeffer. 15,000 churches, some of them actually sided with Hitler, but the majority of them, 12,000 churches, said, we can't get involved politically. This is outside our realm of spiritual discourse. And what happened was the tragedy of Nazi Germany, the tragedy of the Holocaust. How many lives were lost? How many human lives were lost?
Is it being repeated now?
I am sobered to say, I believe we're in a Bonhoeffer moment. And if the church does not wake up, I believe it will be too late.
And you've always said it's not just enough to pray. We can pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We need to get actively involved. How can we get involved?
We can get involved in several ways. Prayer is the beginning point, and I don't want to underestimate the power of prayer. It's powerful, it's crucial. But the second thing is you have to get educated. You have to understand what happened in 1948. What happened in 1967? What are all of these wars that Israel has faced? The reality is Israel's been at war since 48. I mean, there's a brief respite here and a brief, pause there, but attack after attack. Why? This isn't about the creation of a Palestinian state. Israel has offered a two-state solution over and over and over again.
I always tell people Gaza was a two-state. They had their own administration for 20 years.
I was with Prime Minister Sharon in his office about 6 weeks before he made that decision to withdraw from Gaza, and we were discussing that momentous decision. Gaza could have become, the Singapore of the Middle East. It could have become a beautiful, flourishing city. What happened?
Billions for tunnels.
Billions for tunnels.
And rockets.
Not to build schools, not to build up a society. And so what happens is we interpret that Middle East situation through a Western lens. And we say, well, surely all Hamas wants is peace. No, Hamas doesn't want peace. Hamas wants the genocide of the Jewish people, the obliteration of the state of Israel.
Okay, the book is Rise and Rebuild, A Guide to Overcoming Adversity. Bishop Robert Stearns, thank you for being with us.
It's great to be with you today. Thank you,
Appreciate
brother.
you being here in Virginia Beach.
An honor.
And that was a very special news report put together there by our friends at CBN that really does explain exactly where we are in this moment of history. And like you were saying earlier in the program, Chris, this does feel like we are living through the 1930s all over again. This time, it's not coming from the top down. In other words, we're not having the Nazi pogroms, we're not having the Aryan policies being pushed through, like the Nuremberg laws that the Nazis did when they took power in the 1930s, backed up by the SS, and the whole state of Germany was under the control and the influence of Hitler and the Nazis. This time it seems to be coming up from grassroots. So instead of coming from the top, being imposed on the Jewish people on top, is coming up for the grassroots, pretty much through media, and particularly the influence of social media as well, which then is influencing public opinion, and this in turn is changing government policies in the West because they're concerned about the electoral impact of those who hold these very disturbing anti-Israel views. But share with us as we unpack this Red-Green Alliance, which is this alliance now between the Islamists and the hard left, that are only really united on one issue, and that's the hatred of Israel and the Jewish people. And you can see that in the manifestos of the Green Party, for example. Just share with us the danger, really, of this new alliance that poses not only to the Jewish people, but we know ultimately when the Jewish people are attacked, then our own freedoms become attacked. This is always repeated in history because the Jewish people are the canary in the mine shaft. And if they die because of the gases, then this is a warning that all the miners are going to die. In other words, the Jewish people are the canary in the mine for our society. If they're in trouble, then we're in trouble.
Yeah, so again, we see very similar similarities to the 1930s. As you said, at the time, propaganda was coming from the government machine coming down, but this time the machine that's being used today are the top conglomerates of media outlets who are actually, they're the ones that are spewing out the propaganda, and people on the grassroots level where we excuse me, all have one of these at our disposal, and so they're literally programming the masses. I don't like using terms like that because it sounds very conspiracy theory, but that's the reality of the day that which we're living in. So we have all these people that are indoctrinated with this new kind of doctrine of the day, which is modern hyper-leftist liberalism. And the trouble is with liberalism is what it does is it seeks to devalue and undermine the culture in which you live. So basically, because you and I are white, okay, according to liberal ideology, therefore we should be ashamed of ourselves. We should be ashamed because we're guilty of colonialism and slavery and various things, which ironically the Muslims have done exactly the same thing as well, but they won't go there because that's a different story. So we have to dismantle our culture. We have to dismantle now, and this is happening in Christianity, our music and arts and culture, and airbrush out where white people were influential and stuff where, and we focus on black people. Also, liberal theology doesn't like, excuse me, Judeo-Christian society and culture. And so one of the reasons why it's teaming up with the Muslims, for example, is the narrative is that the Muslims are the persecuted ones here, and Israel, they're the baddies, they're the demons, they're the ones that are causing all the problems in the world, which is exactly the same in 1930 when it was like, who can we blame for the problems in society? I know, let's blame the Jews. And that was what was put out there, and that's what's the same narrative today. Hello, the problem with the world and the problem with the Middle East today is not the Muslims, it's not the Arabs or anything like that, it's Israel. And if Israel weren't there, then we wouldn't have these problems that we're here today. That's really the spin and the narrative that we're getting today. And so you're seeing this alliance, like that guy said in that video, where you're seeing militant Islam with this new militant secularism that are coming together with, what's the word, with a common enemy, which is Israel. And if we can do away with that and come together, then we can bring this new kind of utopia to the world. But the trouble is with liberalism is it ultimately destroys itself. So it will allow militant Islam to do what it's going to do, and then people will wake up, by which time it's too late. And we can have militant Islam and radical Islam on our streets. And I do believe that we're already seeing the beginnings of an Islamic uprising in this country. Now, some people go, well, Chris, that's a little bit over the top. But I only have to look at what's going on, in these protests that are still carrying on. These protests, and I need to say this, these protests are not about what the Chinese government are doing to Muslims, where they're sterilizing women and torturing them in torture camps. No one's protesting on the streets about that.
Also harvesting their body organs as well.
Exactly.
And selling them to the Saudis.
And it should be a public outcry. Absolutely should be a public outcry about it. But no one wants to protest about that because that's not what this is about. This is about good old-fashioned Jew hatred, anti-Semitism. And we're seeing exactly the same things that happened in 1930 happening again, played out. But not just played out more subtly. This time it's right in your face. And that's why I fear that, amongst other things and other variables, that if Labour gets into power and we keep going down this road that we're going in, I might imagine within the next year to 2 years, we're going to see things in this nation that we wouldn't believe was possible. Which
another indication that we're under judgment. But if we actually break down and have a look at Islamist ideology, we think that the Nazi ideology pretty much died with the death of Hitler in May of 1945 as the Soviet Union destroyed Berlin, and the Allies were moving towards Berlin, and Hitler felt he had no way out other than to commit suicide, which then we thought, with the destruction of Nazi Germany and with Nazism, that this was the end of Nazism. But when we look at this Islamist ideology, it's a fusion. It's a fusion of radical Islamic theology combined with Nazism. It's that influence of, for example, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Al-Hamid Husseini, who met with Hitler, who forged his own SS division in the Balkans. And it's the influence that he had on the Arabs in the Middle East during the 1940s, where we see that influence from the Muslim Brotherhood together with that Nazi ideology. And this is just really Nazism in another form, because it's almost exactly what is represented by Hamas. And what I suppose is very different about this conflict post-October the 7th is that before, it was pretty much Israel that was targeted. Yeah. Now all Jewish people are targeted now. Yeah. And that is the danger that we face. But what can we learn from the lessons of the famous German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who defied the Nazis, who tried to mobilize the evangelical churches in Germany to tell them about the evil of Hitler and the evil of Nazism. And we're also facing a crossroads moment in this nation, in Europe, and also in the United States in the West, because we are now coming face to face with this evil for the first time.
Yeah, I'm sure Bonhoeffer would be turning in his grave if he saw where things are at historically right now. Well, there's that old saying is that one of the things that we learn from history is that we never learn from history. True. And this is exactly where we're at now. And I do believe the church is at a Bonhoeffer moment again. You know, as we heard from that short clip, that how he went around visiting 15 to 18,000 different churches and speaking to them, and only 3,000 churches agreed with him. And I'm seeing the same thing again. I went, after the October the 7th massacre, I went to dinner with a Messianic Jewish friend of mine, and he wrote a book called The Jewish Jesus. And he was basically saying he was really deeply saddened, dumbstruck, and even angry at the churches. He said, you know, before October the 7th, churches were quite warming up to the whole Israel thing. Some weren't, but you know, he was always invited to talk about it, and they were all very friendly to him. He said, but after October the 7th, he said the churches just went completely silent, completely dead. And this is exactly the same thing that happened in 1930. See, Bonhoeffer was saying to them, look, this is a potential problem that we've got coming in our nation. And they were like, well, we don't want to get politically involved because, you know, we're the church, and we don't want to get involved in politics. And that's exactly the same narrative that's coming out today. Churches are like, well, we don't want to get involved because politically, you know, we're a church. We don't want to get involved in politics. And it's like, okay, let's just wind this back a bit. If we look at what actually happened on October the 7th, and if people actually saw the footage that I saw and that you've seen and others have seen, they would know that this goes way beyond politics. And this way goes beyond whether you're replacement in your theology. This is actually a moral compass issue of what is evil and what is good. So yeah, if it means you have to get political to stand up for good against evil, then you get political. Absolutely. If it means you have to stand up theologically on an opinion that's not popular because that's good and it's not evil, then we have to stand up for good and fight against evil. But at the moment, the church, for the most part, is sitting by doing nothing, just as like she's done with the whole other agendas through the liberal things that have come out with, whether it's to do with climate change, or gender ideology and things. The church has remained silent and therefore in some respects has become complicit. And I think in this generation, at this hour and this time, the church needs to have a prophetic voice, and she is completely quiet. And so yeah, I think, you know, it's quite prophetic and ironic that a film about Bonhoeffer is coming out now at this time, because it's reflecting and revealing exactly the same problems that he had in his day that we've now got in ours.
Yeah, so from that excellent CBN News report we showed there, and some of the figures are staggering. So out of the 18,000 churches that Bonhoeffer reached out to warn them about the dangers of Nazism, the dangers of Hitler's regime, who came to power democratically in the elections in 1933, only 3,000 responded and said, we're with you. And the 12,000 were indifferent. because they didn't want to get involved in politics. Now, there must be something fundamentally wrong with our Bible colleges, with those who are being taught theology, to think that what happens in the political realm has no influence on the church. And when you look at this in the bigger picture, where Christians are being persecuted for their faith in the third world, largely in Islamic countries, but also in countries like North Korea and China as well, they are living under totalitarian regimes. The fact that this nation, and together with the United States, has actually fought against tyranny and against the Nazis, and that men and women sacrifice their lives for the freedoms we have today, surely this is an indication that the church has to get involved in politics, has to be the moral conscience of the nation, and to speak up when it sees evil. But it's not. And incredible, what we're getting is this deafening silence by saying, that's political, I don't want to get involved. And you know, the church is in retreat. And yet when we look at the scriptures, we know that we have the Messiah, Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who's coming back to rule and reign on this earth. We are the ones on the winning side, not the losing side. So why does the church act as if it's losing?
Well, it's a complicated question, but I mean, the problem that we've got today is we've got churches that are filled with evangelifish. That's Christians with no spine, if I be blunt. And I think a lot of it comes down to theology as well. So I know of one particular church in our area where they won't put up a doctrinal statement on their website because, well, we don't want theology to be something that divides us. You know, it's important that we get people coming in, and we don't want theology to be the reason why people get offended and leave. And it's actually, no, it's your theology which should either invite people that want to come to your church, or should be your theological statement be like, well, I don't want to go to that church. So, you know, we have a mission statement and a theological statement on our website that says what we fundamentally believe in. And this notion that churches have become entertainment centers and we don't want to offend people and we want to keep it nice and we want the gospel to be like this nice hyper grace, feel good message, which Bonhoeffer was very much against in his day. Because you see, I saw some quotes just earlier on when we come into the studio of his. He understood the condition of man. He understood that man was a sinner, and that we don't gloss over the fact that man is a sinner. And he's very clear on the fact that, as Apostle Paul says, the flesh lusts against the spirit and the spirit lusts against the flesh. In others, there's a war that's going on within us. And as it says at the end of Romans 7, you know, I know the good that I ought to do, but I can't do, therefore I need Jesus Christ. And this is the issue that we have in church today. They won't talk about sin. They won't stand up for the big issues. Instead, what they've done is that they've politicized their message, ironically, because they don't want to get involved in politics. And now they're more interested in going into the world and recycling than going into the world and making disciples. And they're more interested in climate change and BLM and things like that, rather than actually the actual moral issue that's sat right on their doorstep, which is the issue of anti-Semitism, which is rife in the church. And as was said in that article earlier on, replacement theology is one of the reasons why the church has become so anti-Zionist and anti-Israel, because we've replaced you and we feel threatened by you, so we don't want to talk about you, we want to have nothing to do, and we certainly don't want to defend you, which I think is terrible.
Yeah, and when it talks, linking it to kind of Bonhoeffer's day in the late 20s and in the going into the 30s, I mean, Bonhoeffer's father was a professor, university lecturer at the University of Berlin. We know also that Bonhoeffer himself was, he studied kind of theology, so his academic credentials are quite incredible. Even then became a lecturer in theology again at Berlin University as well. But one thing that is so impressive, I think, about Bonhoeffer is the fact that he discerned evil right from the start. Yeah. He saw that evil was emerging with the Nazis. It's not like Hitler came to power in 1933 in the democratic elections. Then we saw that he burnt down the Reichstag, which was the German parliament, and then replaced the president of Germany and made himself the Führer, the leader of Nazi Germany, and then did away with all democratic elections and took power. So it's not like Bonhoeffer saw within 2 or 3 years what was happening in Germany, he understood it straight away, and he opposed it straight away. Shouldn't we actually be doing the same of when we came face to face with evil? And this brings me back to these pro-Palestinian rallies. Now, after a couple of weeks after October the 7th, being in central London, getting caught up in these rallies themselves, it literally felt I was coming face to face with evil. The chance of genocide, the Palestinian flags everywhere. It was like a death cult. And I always wondered what it would be like to be in Munich in the early 1930s or the mid 1930s, the rise of Nazism.
Different flag, basically.
Yeah, but the same spirit.
Spirit, yeah.
That spirit of Jew hatred. Now, if I can feel that face to face, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers do as well, and having seen the horrors of October the 7th and then seen what Hamas did, don't they know that the same ideology is here in this country, where they want to take over this nation for Islam? This isn't a religion in its sense like Christianity and like modern Christianity that doesn't. It's all about values, it's all about morality, it's how you pray, it's going to mosque, it's reading the Quran. No, Islam means submission. So it's a highly politicized religion with a highly politicized goals. And we see that the vast majority of those who've taken to the streets support the ideology of Hamas. That is surely got to be a wake-up call, not only for our government, but also for the churches.
But you've seen what's happened with the government when the MPs get death threats. They just kowtow to, okay, we'll put it on our manifesto that we'll try and get a Gaza ceasefire and all this kind of stuff. So it clearly seems to me that the politicians have been infiltrated by fear. And again, the church has been in a state of fear for the last probably 15 years, whether it's dealing with issues such as gay marriage or gender ideology or green agendas and stuff. The church has just simply decided to not speak up. So here we are many years later, now we've got this evil literally on our streets. She's just, as I said earlier, she's just got no backbone, she's got no spine. And again, because we preach a very light, fluffy Christianity these days, we don't understand the impact and the darkness and the evilness of sin. And therefore, when it's on our streets, we don't recognize it when it's staring us right in the face.
No, absolutely. I just want to read out a quote that Bonhoeffer made in 1940. This was about the church in Germany. He says, "The church was silent when it should have cried out, because the blood of the innocent was crying aloud to heaven. She is guilty of the deaths of the weakest and the most defenseless brothers of Jesus Christ." He also spoke up really for the way that Christian leaders were treating, for example, the Messianic Jewish believers, considering that they were then classified as being biologically Jewish, so therefore they were not like the rest of the Gentile Christian congregation.
Second-class Christians.
And we saw that Bonhoeffer spoke up for them. And the response from the vast majority of other Christian leaders in Germany, that Bonhoeffer found himself at odds. This is not the message of the gospel. No. Are we not doing the same thing? That because we see the rise of Islamism, we see the rise of this far left woke ideology that is infiltrating our society, it's impacting on our churches, that we're cowering to it and sacrificing Israel and the Jewish people in order to have a little bit of breathing space before this comes after the church in this country.
We're basically bowing down to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, whatever the tune is of the government and whatever the tune is politically of the land at that time, where the church is just for the most part bowing down to it. But, one of the things that kind of irks me somewhat with replacement theology is if you just take the New Testament by its own authority, because obviously people at replacement don't really want anything to do with the Old Testament. So you just look at Romans 11, and the Apostle Paul says, "I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he?" That's the question. That's what everyone's asking now. Has God rejected his people? He's talking about Israel. May it never be. Okay, so he said it once. But does he say it again? Verse 2, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. So he says it again. And then he goes on to say, what then? What Israel is seeking is not obtained, for those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. In verse 11, I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? may it never be. So he said there 3 times now that Israel, even though, you know, they didn't get justified by faith, that God has not rejected Israel, God has not replaced Israel. And so this notion that the church is the new Israel, it is fundamentally wrong on various different levels. And then Paul quite goes on to say, he talks about the arrogance of the Gentiles, saying, hey, don't think that you're better than them because you've been grafted in. He goes on to say, quite right, they were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. Verse 22, behold then the kindness and severity of God to those who fell, severity, but to you God's kindness. If you continue in his kindness, otherwise you will be cut off. Gentiles have no concept that, what, we, Gentiles, we couldn't possibly be cut off. So only Israel could be cut off, right? And then he goes on to say in verse 23, and they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. And then he goes on to say, you know, that you are not the root supports you, Gentiles. It's quite clear that God has not finished with Israel, and God has a plan for Israel. And so when churches say, well, we're not going to get involved in the whole Israel thing because it's political. Yes, I guess it is political. Or we're not going to get involved with the whole Israel thing because it's theological. It doesn't matter if it's theological. It doesn't matter if it's what the argument is. It is the moral right thing to do at this time. Theologically, it is the right thing to do. And I think Gentiles need to get over themselves a little bit here. You know, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer had to come against that. Again, it was a form of anti-Semitism. Well, if you're a Christian, but actually you've got Jewish heritage, you're some kind of second-class believer. Even though Paul says, you know, all, whether you're Jew, whether you're Gentile, whether you're free, whether you're slave, whether you're male, whether you're female, we're all now one new man in Christ Jesus. There's no cultural levels, there's no degrees, there's no man's better than woman, there's no slave owner is better than a slave, Jew is better than Jew. That's gone. And for the church to actually encourage that kind of philosophy, I think is abhorrent and evil. And yet we still see the same thing today. Actually see the same thing in our churches today. And so, you know, when we were talking before the show, I'm actually genuinely disturbed and frightened for this nation, and especially for the church. I have to be honest, I just don't think things are going to change quick enough of opinion within the churches to see this before it's too late. I just don't see it. I mean, I know what your opinion is, but I think we're already too late down the road on this.
But God always raises up a remnant.
He does, yes.
He always raises up
and
a remnant.
he raises up the prophetic voice like a Bonhoeffer.
When we see, for example, and this is why I think that this program, because this wasn't really on my agenda when I asked you to be my guest on the Middle East Report, but I felt a very kind of prompting in my spirit to actually discuss this topic today, because I think we have to learn from great men from the past, and you know, Bonhoeffer was one of those great men that stood against the Nazis. He was a Protestant theologian. He knew the Bible well. He knew what evil was. But not only did he resist the Nazis, but he was also very much involved in the assassination attempt on Hitler's life on the 20th of July 1944. And, you know, if you've seen the Tom Cruise film Valkyrie, it's all about that, where leading officers in the German army felt that, look, Hitler's going to destroy, we're losing this war, and he's going to destroy Germany. We have to kill him in order to make peace with the Allies and stop the war. So, you know, to say that I oppose the Nazis and then to mobilize churches to come against it, and then put him in a situation then where he was part of the assassination plot against Hitler, and actually then worked as a spy, despite the fact that he was working in the Department of Military Intelligence. He was working with the conspirators to overthrow Hitler. He then also had meetings in Sweden, where he met with British representatives and had the message of German officers who opposed Hitler, and to say, look, if we get rid of Hitler, will you end the war? But of course the Allies said, no, we want the total destruction of Nazism. So he played a role there with incredible bravery and courage. He was then found out in 1943 that he was involved, and obviously through interrogation and others, and his name seemed to link with the other conspirators, that he paid the ultimate price, ultimate sacrifice for his defiance against the Nazis, that he was hung, in April, on the 9th of April 1945, only a few weeks before the war came to the end.
Yeah.
And yet here's a man that we can look back almost 85 years and say he was, and he did give a prophetic voice and a warning. And we should learn from his experience about Nazism and how we're seeing again today this rise of evil. And we know it's evil because it targets the Jewish people. And this should be troubling, not only to our governments, but also to our churches. Not only do our churches need to pray, but they need to rid themselves, as you said, the shackles of church replacement theology. Because we know that this theology comes from the pit of hell. Yeah. It's made our churches weak, ineffective. We don't see the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and then it opens up to liberalism. But then the foundation of this theology is that you can't trust God.
Yes,
in church replacement theology. If he broke his promise and he said to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, this is an everlasting covenant that I make with the Jewish people forever, then what does forever mean? Yeah. And if he can break his promises to the Jewish people, like he has if you believe in church replacement theology, then why not us? Yeah. Our salvation is not secure. Yeah. So surely this time should be a big wake-up call to church leaders who have been indoctrinated by this demonic ideology, a theology that is church replacement theology.
Well, I wrote a book several years back called The Biblical Importance of Israel, which is on Amazon. It's only like about £6. But that actually goes, it goes right from the beginning of the scriptures and underpins the importance of the Abrahamic covenant. Because when you get to the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, that's his argument, that the Abrahamic covenant is what we're really grafted into, because that had a promise both for the Jews, had a promise about the land, and a promise that the Gentiles would be somehow part of this promise as well. So through Christ we're grafted into that. But as you say, if you believe in replacement theology, if God suddenly breaks his promises to Israel and breaks his promises to the Jewish people, when he covenanted that land to them forever, which is a very long time, when you have that kind of theology running at the back of your mind, I think it does things to you. Because in the letter of James, James says, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And if you've got a theology that's saying, I can trust God, God is a covenant God, yet at the back of your mind these little bells are ringing saying, yeah, but he broke his covenant with Israel, how can you ever really stand on that? If the scriptures say that God created Adam and Eve in the way that he created, and the Hebrew word says, he uses the word bara, which means he miraculously created Adam. He didn't evolve over time, but you get a lot of Christians that are like, well, okay, we will go along with the evolutional theory so that we can go along with the scientific theory, even though Pauline doctrine states the first Adam and the second Adam, or the first Adam and the last Adam, that therefore implicitly, how can you truly believe in the doctrine of salvation, which is about the two Adams, if you believe in evolution? So you've got all these kind of weird things going around in the back of Christians' minds, which leads us to doubt the integrity of God's word, and it naturally makes us more liberal in our understanding of the world, and it actually enables us to become more lenient on the things of sin, more worldly minded. And so when we see the political agendas and ideologies of the day, we tend to be more encompassing and embracing of those things than not. Whereas Bonhoeffer, he was a man that was deeply trained in the things of the word. He knew his theology well. He understood about the nature of sin and the nature of evil and Satan and all that, what Jesus came to do. And when you have that mindset, you can spot evil straight away. It's a bit like those people that say deal with counterfeit money. Well, we know we can spot counterfeit money, not by studying counterfeit money, but we see the real thing so often that when we see the counterfeit, we spot it straight away. And Christians that have good orthodoxy and good theology in their lives tend to spot evil straight away, whereas those that don't tend to be confused and not see it.
Absolutely. I suppose the other aspect to look at this one is the incredible fulfillment of Scripture ever since 1948, with the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. The fact that the nation of Israel was born on one single day, on the 14th of May 1948, in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The return of the Jewish people from the four corners of the earth, and making Aliyah, the fact that the desert is blooming, are all part of the prophetic scriptures relating to Israel. So surely this is also something incredibly exciting, because we can literally see these ancient prophecies that actually prophesize the return of the Jewish people to their land and homeland again being fulfilled in our day. And we can point that this is what God is doing through the nations. And not only that, but nations who bless Israel are blessed, and those nations who curse Israel are cursed. And this is why this general election of 2024 is so crucial, because it's imperative that we have a nation and a government that blesses the Jewish people, and the nation of Israel will depend on our spiritual blessing that we have in this country.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, as a broadcast journalist, I can't tell you how many times I've seen this curse and blessing come into being. And so therefore, you know, do we want a curse over our nation? Do we want to be in spiritual darkness? We will be if we don't stand up and speak up for Israel. But I fear that time is running out, because I fear that the time that we have this opportunity to speak freely like we are now could be coming to an end. The time that we are living in, have our democratic freedoms, we can go where we want, we can go to church, we can have Bible studies, we can study the Word of God, could soon be coming to an end, because we know that we're up against a radical Islamist ideology that is all-encompassing, and it wants control. And with it, and the heart of this ideology is this hatred of Israel and the Jewish people. So we know where that comes from.
Yeah, and some people at home might be thinking, oh, I can't see that ever happening. But when you've got a government that could potentially be in power after this, you know, when the show is aired, that are very much behind the Islamophobic law, which again, it seeks to undermine, delegitimize, again, any kind of conversation that we're having now, because it would be deemed Islamophobic because we're speaking out against what's going on, and it would put basically a gag order on us. It would cause problems for churches, and so, you know, our freedoms are gradually being eroded already. But again, you know, the church doesn't get it. The church, I'm sorry if I'm a bit angry, but I am a bit fed up with it, if I'm quite honest with you. And I'm fed up with being that there's a lot of voices in Britain that are speaking up, but they're too pitifully few, unfortunately, whereas the majority of the churches don't care and are indifferent. And if that makes me angry, and I'm just a human, well, I wonder what it does to God in his heart, that his own people will not stand up for his own people. You know, the people that he's chosen, the people that he's predestined, like in Romans 11, God has not forsaken them. God's got a plan for the Jewish people. And the fact that the church just arrogantly presupposes that she's replaced them, and the fact that Israel's a nation again is some kind of political anomaly. It's just not true, and it breaks God's heart.
And Chris, we've got 5 minutes left of the programme, and this is one of the main reasons why I invited you onto the Middle East Report in the first place, is because my good friend in the Jewish community, Stephen Jaffe, said that you're a good guy and that you would make an excellent guest for the programme. So when you get recommendations from some of my Jewish friends and contacts that I work with, to have a Christian pastor who gets Israel, but I don't think it's enough to have the theological understanding of Israel in these days. I think there has to be a practical outworking of that. And where you can bless and touch the Jewish people, I think is essential, especially now after October the 7th. This incredible fear that swept over Jewish communities throughout the world are living in fear. They're living in a time of increasing anxiety, a time of attacks. And even in Israel now, a lot of Israeli Jewish people don't feel that safe being in Israel anymore after the horrors of October the 7th. So therefore, isn't it imperative that Christians, that we actually show them that love, get involved with Jewish causes, and work with them? I mean, there's an incredible testimony. I've got a Jewish guest coming on, and this is all to do with helping Israeli soldiers in the IDF and Christians getting alongside. And it's an amazing testimony that we can have to remind them of who they are in God and the call of God upon their lives. And they also remind us that we are also grafted in to that Commonwealth of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, we had Stephen Jaffe and a guy called Michael Zeffert that came to our church, and we just got them to, you know, Michael Zeffert, he helps oversee a synagogue, and we got him to pray us out at the end of our service, and we got Stephen Jaffe just to talk about some of the stuff that's been going on, and then we just opened it up for questions and answers. And I think, you know, Stephen and Michael were really touched and blessed that there was a community of Christians there that actually really support them, because what they get from the media and what they seem to get from a lot of Christianity is this stone wall of silence or just hatred. And I think the Jewish people need to know that if you do support Israel, that they need to know that. They need to know that there are more Christians out there. So there's been those rallies in London, haven't there, where Jews and Christians have been coming together,
Absolutely.
which is really important. Those things are important. Also practically doing stuff. That's why, as a church leader, I make it my business to make friends with Jewish people. You know, I'm on the MDA, Magen David Adom National Council, and so it's not just a question of just praying for Israel, which is good and important, but also practically being a blessing to the people of Israel as well. And I think that's really important. And I think as a church, our congregation, I think it's good for them and they're blessed because they feel that they're actually interacting with real Jewish issues, real Jewish people and real Jewish causes, which I think is really important. I think it's good for us to do it, and I think it's good for the Jewish people to know that they do actually have friends out there. You know, not all Christians are against them. Actually, there's a lot that are for them. But I just wish, speaking to the camera, that many Christians would actually stand up and have a voice and speak up for the cause of Israel. You know, your church leaders may be saying nothing about it, but I'm not trying to cause a revolt here, but actually Christians need to speak up because I think we're on the cusp of something quite climatic in our nation right now, and now's the time that we really need not to be silent.
Yeah, I mean, following on the line from Eric Metaxas, who also did the very impressive biography of Bonhoeffer that I haven't read, but I need to read it, really says the role of the church is to be the moral conscience of the nation. And I think for the last 30, 40, maybe 50 years, the church hasn't been that in the West. And of course, what we've seen is this erosion of our Judeo-Christian heritage with politicians, including Christian politicians, who've come into government, become ministers, and have eroded that Judeo-Christian heritage. And we're seeing that our society and our nations are becoming increasingly more secular, more humanistic, and as a result has created a spiritual vacuum, and we're seeing that Islamic extremism is filling that vacuum. And this alliance with the hard left who want to overthrow the West. They are against the nation states, and also we see moves towards world government. So we definitely are living in the last days, but it's what we do with it and how we stand up for Israel and the Jewish people that counts. Chris, excellent program. Thank you so much for being on the program today, and thank you so much for giving a prophetic voice that is so needed. And thank you for your church in standing with Israel and the Jewish people.
It's a privilege to be here. Thank you.
And I want to thank you for watching this program at home. I think we need to learn the lessons from Bonhoeffer, who not only was a German theologian who understood the Bible, but he also put the Bible into action in his defiance against the Nazi regime that ultimately cost him his life. He tried to wake the church up in Germany before it was too late. We need to do exactly the same at this time of rising evil and hatred against the Jewish people, because what starts with the Jewish people never finishes with the Jewish people. So I want to thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.